I might just hold the world record for the fastest time between moving into a new neighborhood and having the cops called on me just 24 hours flat. The reason? The HOA president's entitled blatantly racist son decided that my private swimming pool was actually his personal water park, and when I told him otherwise, his mother, self-proclaimed queen of the cul-de-sac, stormed in to back him up. Here's the twist that really flipped the script. I'm the police commander they called to deal with the disturbance. Yep, you read that right. Buckle in, because this story takes some wild turns. Drop a comment to let me know where you're watching from, because trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next. My life is built around discipline and high stakes. Being a commander in a major city police department means juggling endless personnel issues, tight budgets, strategic planning, and the exhausting politics that come with the job. After my wife Sarah passed away a few years ago, the silence in our large family home grew unbearably loud. With my daughter now off at college, that once vibrant space had turned into a hollow reminder of a life I no longer lived. So I made a choice. I needed peace, a fresh start, somewhere quiet enough that the fizz of a cold drink could be the day's soundtrack. After months of searching, I found it. A sleek, modern 2-bedroom home in a serene subdivision called Willow Creek Estates. The name alone sounded like tranquility. Located just 30 minutes outside the city, the neighborhood was upscale, mostly white, and famous for its meticulously groomed lawns and whisper-quiet streets. My new house wasn't massive, but it was an architectural gem: sharp lines, dark wood, expansive glass, and best of all, a stunning in-ground saltwater pool, wrapped in a high privacy fence and lush professional landscaping. It was my personal oasis. This home was meant to be my private oasis. Space where I could finally decompress and simply exist without pressure or performance. I paid a hefty premium for that dream, and as I signed the closing documents, I envisioned myself drifting in the crystal-clear saltwater pool, my daily stress melting away under the warmth of the summer sun. The move itself was a whirlwind, exhausting but tightly organized. By the end of the first day, every box was inside, and I found myself relaxing on brand new patio furniture, watching the sunset paint the sky in stunning shades of orange and purple. The air smelled clean, birds chirped in the distance, and a wave of deep, satisfying calm washed over me. I remember thinking, with full sincerity, that this was going to be perfect. Looking back now, my optimism feels almost cute. The very next morning, as I stood in my kitchen setting up the coffee maker, the doorbell rang. On my porch stood a woman who appeared to have been sculpted from pure disapproval, probably in her late 50s, with a shell of blonde hair so firm it could survive a wind tunnel, and a pastel pink pantsuit that practically shouted, "I'd like to speak to the manager of the entire zip code." Clutched in one perfectly manicured hand was a thick binder of documents. "Good morning," I said with a polite smile. "I'm Marcus." Her eyes flicked over me in a quick scan, taking in the t-shirt, the bare feet, and stopping somewhere behind me like she was searching for the actual homeowner. "I'm Brenda," she announced with icy precision, "president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association." She extended the binder like a warrant. "This is our welcome packet. It includes the covenants, conditions, restrictions, bylaws, and our fine schedule. I highly suggest you read it thoroughly. We maintain very high standards in this community." Her tone dripped with performative politeness and barely disguised condescension, the kind I'd encountered too many times before, the kind that doesn't say you're not welcome, but makes damn sure you feel it. "Thank you, Brenda," I replied, my friendly smile tightening just slightly as I took the binder from her. "I'll be sure to give it a look." "Looking forward to being part of the community," I said, keeping my tone light. Brenda responded with a tight, robotic nod that carried the clear message, "I'll believe it when I see it." She added, The monthly dues are due on the 1st. The packet has instructions for setting up automatic payments. We find that's easier for new people. There was a subtle but undeniable pause before the words new people, heavy with implication. I knew exactly what she meant. In her eyes, I wasn't just a new neighbor, I was an anomaly. A black man in a predominantly white, meticulously curated neighborhood. To her, I wasn't just unexpected. I was unwelcome, a disruption to the aesthetic she believed she controlled. The whole interaction left a bitter taste in my mouth, but I shook it off. Every neighborhood has its overzealous watchdogs. I wasn't going to let one uptight woman ruin the peace I'd fought so hard to create. I had a pool, and it was calling my name. That afternoon, the sun was blazing and the sky cloudless. I changed into my swim trunks, grabbed a towel and a book, and headed outside to my slice of serenity. The water was the perfect temperature, cool and soothing. I floated on my back, eyes closed, letting the soft slosh of the pool erase the sour tension left by Brenda's welcome. For a solid half hour, it was everything I'd hoped for: peaceful, quiet, rejuvenating. Then came the rattling. Sharp metallic clatter at the pool gate snapped me out of my relaxation, followed by a loud, abrasive voice yelling, "Hey yo, open up." I sat upright, treading water, and turned toward the sound. 3 teenagers were standing on the other side of my locked fence, one of them aggressively yanking the handle like he had every right to be there. He was tall and lanky, with a smug sneer plastered across his face, dressed in sagging shorts and a flashy designer shirt that probably cost more than my entire outfit. "Can I help you?" I called out, swimming toward the edge of the pool, standing outside the gate to my backyard, not a shared facility. The kid crossed his arms, his sneer deepening as if my words were some kind of challenge. "Nah, man. My mom says it's for everyone. She said the last owner let people use it, so it's fair game." His confidence was clearly borrowed from Brenda's overblown sense of entitlement, and he was riding it like a skateboard. "Well, I'm not the last owner," I replied, my tone still calm but firmer now. "And this pool is not open to the neighborhood. It's mine. You and your friends need to leave." His bravado wavered slightly, but he doubled down, jiggling the handle again as if that would magically change the facts. "If you don't let us in, I'm telling my mom. You'll be sorry." His voice had a whiny edge now, more threat than logic. His 2 friends, already uncomfortable, took a couple of steps back, clearly sensing the line had been crossed. I stepped a little closer, towel draped over one shoulder, water still dripping from my hair. "Tell your mom whatever you want," I said, locking eyes with him, "but this is private property. If you try to get in again, I'll have no choice." But to involve law enforcement, that made him pause. There was a beat of silence before he muttered something under his breath and turned away, motioning for his friends to follow. They shuffled off down the street, tossing nervous glances over their shoulders. I stood there for a moment, heart steady, anger simmering just below the surface. So this was the welcome wagon. The son of the HOA president trying to muscle his way into my sanctuary like it was a public park. I dried off and went back inside, the chill of the encounter lingering despite the summer heat. Into retreat, hopping back onto the sidewalk as his friends begged him to chill out. His face was a storm of frustration and humiliation, the kind that only comes when someone raised on privilege suddenly hits an immovable wall. I watched silently from behind the glass, phone still in hand, as Kevin paced and fumed, waving his arms and barking into his phone, no doubt giving Brenda the performance of a lifetime. But I wasn't rattled. I had every second of his meltdown on video, captured in pristine 4K from 3 angles, with crisp audio that made every racial slur and threat admissible evidence. My years of police work had taught me many things: how to stay calm under pressure, how to de-escalate chaos, and most importantly, how to protect myself legally and tactically. Kevin, oblivious to who he was dealing with, had just made a serious mistake. I could already imagine Brenda storming back over, armed with righteous indignation and freshly sprayed hair, demanding an apology and access to what she still believed was a community resource. Let her come. The moment her stilettos hit my driveway, I'd have the footage queued up and waiting. But for now, I let Kevin fume on the sidewalk, his bravado crumbling under the weight of his own actions. I stayed inside, towel still over my shoulder, watching it all unfold with a calm, calculating resolve. This neighborhood had welcomed me, with fake smiles and backhanded comments, but today the mask had slipped, and I saw exactly what I was dealing with. What they didn't know, and what they were about to find out the hard way, was that I wasn't just some outsider with a nice house. I was a man who knew the law, enforced it, and wasn't about to let a teenage punk and his queen bee mother bulldoze the peace I'd earned. Back on the sidewalk, Kevin stood flushed and panting, his rage now tempered by the whispers of reason from his friends, who had apparently convinced him that climbing a locked fence to confront a grown man nearly twice his size might not be the tactical masterstroke he imagined. With his little rebellion collapsing, he stabbed at his phone with the kind of furious energy only a teenager fueled by entitlement and ego can muster. I didn't need to guess who he was calling. Act 2 of this suburban tragicomedy was about. To begin, I stayed inside, tablet in hand, watching the live security feed with the surreal detachment of someone observing their own life from a distance. One part of my brain, the trained law enforcement officer, calmly cataloged the offenses: trespassing, verbal threats, attempted forced entry, all documented in crystal clear footage. The other part of me, the new homeowner who just wanted to take a peaceful swim, was burning with frustration. I had owned this sanctuary for exactly 1 day, and already it had been invaded by an ugly, inherited sense of superiority that assumed my very presence in this neighborhood was an error to be corrected. This wasn't just teenage bravado. It was a weaponized worldview passed down like fine china. Less than 5 minutes later, a spotless white Lexus SUV skidded to a halt at the curb. Brenda exploded out of the driver's side like a storm in pastel, her expression thunderous with self-righteous fury. She made a beeline not for my house, but for Kevin, wrapping him in a dramatic hug like he'd just survived a hostage crisis. He leaned into the moment with all the subtlety of a soap opera actor, flailing his arms and pointing toward my house, his voice sharp and whiny as he delivered his one-sided tale of imagined persecution. I couldn't hear the exact words, but the gestures screamed, "He was mean to me." Once thoroughly briefed with her son's accurate version of events, Brenda squared her shoulders, adjusted her power pink pantsuit, and stormed up my driveway, with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. But instead of heading to my front door like a normal person, she stomped straight to the pool gate and began shaking it like a woman possessed. "Open this gate immediately!" she shrieked, her voice high and grating enough to sandblast the siding. "I know you're in there hiding." I took a deep breath, set my tablet down, and decided it was time this face-to-face finally happened. I set the tablet down, walked calmly to the sliding glass door, unlocked it, and stepped out onto the patio, folding my arms across my chest, and meeting Brenda's furious gaze with a controlled, unreadable expression. "Brenda," I said evenly, "we need to have a serious conversation about your son." Her eyes flared with indignation. "I'll be the one having a serious conversation. Thank you very much. And it'll be with the police. How dare you threaten a child who is simply trying to use a community amenity that our dues pay for." The audacity of her words was so outrageous it almost took my breath away. She was doubling down on a lie so absurd, so easily disproven, that it would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. "Brenda," I said, clearly and slowly, each word crisp with emphasis. This is not a community pool. It is my private pool located on my private property. The very HOA documents you handed me this morning explicitly state that this backyard area is not part of any shared amenity. Your son trespassed after being told he was not welcome, used racial slurs, and made threats, all of which are recorded on my security system. At the mention of security footage, something flickered behind her eyes, a brief flash of uncertainty, a tightening around the mouth, but it was quickly crushed beneath the weight of her inflated self-importance. Recorded? She snapped. Don't you threaten me with your little spy cameras. That's probably a violation of the bylaws too. Her voice had risen to a shrill pitch, dripping with the kind of entitlement that thinks shouting loud enough turns lies into facts. You're the one trespassing. This entire backyard area is H.O.A. common space, and you've illegally commandeered it. Now she was simply inventing rules as she went, grasping at imaginary straws to prop up her crumbling narrative. It was pathetic, infuriating, and sadly predictable. Puffing out her chest like she was rallying for a noble cause, she jabbed a finger in the air and declared with theatrical resolve, I am calling the authorities. Back down, watching the live security feed again, my emotions caught in a strange current between smoldering anger and clinical fascination. And I'm going to have you removed. We'll see who has the right to be here. Brenda shrieked as she whipped out her phone with dramatic flair, her posture vibrating with smug satisfaction. I didn't move, didn't interrupt, just watched her like I was studying a subject under a microscope. My instinct screamed to shut it all down, to call the on-duty watch commander and end this farce with one word. But I didn't. I wanted to let it play out. I wanted to see how the very system I had dedicated my life to would respond when someone like her made a call like this. White suburban woman reporting a large aggressive man where he supposedly didn't belong. I wanted her to stack the gallows herself, one self-righteous board at a time. Yes, 911, she said, suddenly shifting into a trembling, falsely distressed tone so exaggerated it would have made a stage actress blush. I need police at 124 Willow Creek Lane immediately. There's a man, a very large, aggressive man who's illegally occupying our community pool. He's a squatter. He threatened my teenage son. He's hostile. Please, send someone right away before he gets violent. Her voice dripped with panic, but her eyes locked onto mine with a venomous glint of triumph, like she'd just triggered a trap she was certain would snap shut around me. Ending the call, she gave me a smug, almost gleeful smirk. There. On their way. You're going to jail. I met her gaze calmly and nodded once. Okay, Brenda. Then, without another word, I turned and walked back into my house, locking the door behind me. To her, that act of retreat was proof she'd won. She let out a short, victorious laugh, puffed up with false superiority, and strutted back to the street where her son stood basking in her imagined victory. Inside, I sat down in front of my security console, my pulse steady, my mind sharp. I was furious, yes, but beneath that, I was deeply curious. What would the responding officers do when they arrived at the scene of a lie? When all the evidence pointed in the opposite direction? When one of their own was the target of a false report soaked in racism and entitlement? I didn't have to wait long to find out. I sat in a chair near the window, perfectly positioned with a clear view of the street, watching and waiting as 1,000 thoughts swirled in my head. I imagined the two young patrol officers who would likely respond, visualize them receiving the dispatch. Hostile squatter, aggressive male, possibly violent. I pictured them tensing up, their training kicking in, bracing for confrontation. They'd be expecting a worst-case scenario, adrenaline already flowing. And when they arrived, they'd see exactly what that kind of call primes them for: an agitated white woman waving her arms and screaming accusations. And me, a 6'2" black man standing calmly by a pool that supposedly didn't belong to me. I knew how quickly things could spiral. I'd seen it happen too many times, and the ending was rarely just. But there was another variable. I was their commander. That changed things. Or at least I hoped it would. Just 6 minutes later, a black and white patrol car turned onto my quiet street, its approach somehow vacuuming the sound out of the air. Brenda immediately sprang into action like she'd been waiting for her cue, frantically flagging them. Down, arms flailing, channeling all the drama she could muster. The car stopped at the curb and 2 officers stepped out. I recognized them both instantly, Officer Miller and Officer Chun. They were good officers, sharp, steady, respectful. I'd watched them grow in the job. But today they were being fatally wrapped in hysteria. Brenda launched into her tirade, pointing wildly toward my house, her words tumbling out fast and frantic. To their credit, both officers listened with calm professionalism, nodding occasionally, their expressions unreadable but alert. I noticed Miller's hand shift casually to rest on the grip of his sidearm, not drawing it. Just a subtle, trained instinct, a readiness conditioned by experience. They glanced toward my house, then began walking up the driveway with practiced precision, Miller in the lead, eyes scanning the scene with quiet focus. I didn't wait for them to knock. I opened the door before they reached it and stepped out. Onto the porch slowly, hands empty and clearly visible. "Good afternoon, officers," I said evenly. Miller's eyes locked on mine, recognition flashing across his face, and in that moment, the whole energy shifted. First from the officers, then, slowly from Brenda as the realization began to dawn. Miller squinted, trying to place me, but in this setting, a quiet suburban home, casual shorts and a t-shirt, accused of being a squatter, his brain couldn't quite make the connection. "Sir," he began, his tone crisp with academy-trained authority, "we've had a report of a disturbance. Can you tell me your name and what you're doing here?" From the street, Brenda shrieked, "That's him, he's the one. He's trespassing, get him out of here." But the officers didn't even flinch. Their attention stayed locked on me. This was the moment, the reveal. I reached slowly and deliberately into the back pocket of my shorts, watching their eyes follow the movement out of instinct. "My name is Marcus Thorne," I said, pulling out my wallet. "Didn't say my last name was on the deed, did I?" I flipped it open and held up my badge and department ID. "Commander Marcus Thorne. Good to see you, Miller. Chun." What happened next was almost cinematic. The shift in their expressions moved at lightning speed: confusion, disbelief, realization, then absolute horror. Miller's eyes snapped wide as he instinctively took a step back, yanking his hand off his holstered weapon like it had suddenly burst into flames. Chun's mouth actually dropped open for a second before she caught herself and shut it with a quick, embarrassed snap. "Commander," Miller stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "Sir, we had no idea." He looked over his shoulder toward Brenda, who was still standing on the sidewalk, arms crossed, face twisted in confusion and indignation. Then he turned back to me, his expression a cocktail of stunned disbelief and deep growing discomfort. In that instant, the entire power dynamic on my front lawn shifted like a tectonic plate snapping into place. Brenda had summoned the cavalry, smugly confident they'd march in, put me in cuffs, and restore her false sense of order. Instead, she'd invited them to witness her own dramatic unraveling in real time. The silence that settled over my yard was so thick it felt like pressure in the air, an unspoken, shared panic hanging between us all, and for Brenda, it was just beginning. "Has just filed a false police report," I finished, turning my full attention back to Officer Miller, my tone calm but unmistakably authoritative. Brenda froze mid-step, her eyes widening as if the words had physically struck her. Officer Miller looked stricken, as though he'd just been asked to write a ticket to the governor. "Commander," he said again, the words sounding heavier now, burdened by the weight of what had just shifted. Yes, sir." Chun gave the faintest nod, her face now composed but pale. I could practically see them recalibrating, piecing together the full scope of what they'd walked into. Brenda, still standing in the middle of the driveway, was rapidly unraveling. "Wait, what?" she blurted, her voice cracking. "False report? No, that's not what this is. He was trespassing. I called because he was in the pool and then threatening my son." Her performance was crumbling in real time, and there was no applause coming. "Your son attempted to illegally enter my private property after being told not to," I said flatly, looking her dead in the eye. "He used racial slurs, made threats, and tried to climb my fence. All of which is captured clearly on my security cameras with audio." Brenda's jaw worked wordlessly, her mind visibly scrambling to reverse course, but the ship was already sinking. "You called 911 and gave knowingly false information," I continued. "That's a crime. And Officer Miller, I'd like this incident documented thoroughly. Everything from the original call to her behavior at the scene." Brenda's mouth opened in protest, but no sound came out. She looked at the officers, now both standing formally by my side, then back at me, the man she'd tried to paint as a threat, now revealed as the highest-ranking law enforcement official in the room. Whatever she'd expected when she made that call, this wasn't it. The smug certainty that once lit her face was gone, replaced by a growing panic, one that suggested for the first time she understood just how badly she'd miscalculated. Have crystal clear audio of the racial slurs and verbal threats he hurled in the process, I continued, my voice level but resolute. Officer Chun gave a sharp nod, already reaching for her notepad as her body camera blinked on. "Understood, sir. I'll start recording your statement immediately." Meanwhile, Officer Miller turned fully toward Brenda, whose entire posture had deflated like a balloon punctured mid-float. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "I'm going to need you to answer some questions about the nature of the call you placed to emergency services. For the record, you stated the suspect was a hostile squatter and potentially violent. Can you confirm that's what you reported?" Brenda blinked at him, visibly trembling, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to summon a version of events that wouldn't implicate her further. I didn't know," she stammered, eyes darting from Miller to me to Chun, like a trapped animal looking for a way out. "He didn't say, he didn't look like what?" I asked, my tone flat as granite. She had no answer, just silence. The pink of her pantsuit, so commanding an hour ago, now clashed violently with the fear and confusion in her pale face. "This isn't just about personal bias anymore," I said quietly. "It's about accountability. You weaponized law enforcement against someone who had done absolutely nothing wrong. You endangered me. You endangered your son. And you tried to manipulate the system to do it." Brenda flinched as if slapped. Officer Miller, now calm and fully in procedural mode, activated his body cam's audio and began the formal questioning. Officer Chun stepped closer to me, pen poised. "Whenever you're ready, sir." I nodded and took a breath, casting one last look at Brenda, no longer the queen of the cul-de-sac, just a woman unraveling under the weight of her own lies. "Let's begin." Listed in the incident report, Brenda for filing a false police report and harassment, Kevin for trespassing and attempted breaking and entering. I looked directly at Brenda, now nothing more than a shell of the authoritarian figure she tried to project, and said clearly, "And I will be pursuing charges against you, Brenda, for knowingly filing a false report and for targeted harassment." That sentence shattered what little composure she had left. Her face contorted, panic overtaking her features as she stepped forward, hands wringing, voice trembling with desperation. "No, wait. This is all a misunderstanding. A simple misunderstanding," she stammered. "I didn't know. I was just looking out for the community. I thought Kevin is a good boy. He just got confused. Can't we just forget this whole thing ever happened? Just a neighborly mix-up?" Her plea hung in the air like smoke, already fading before it could land. I stared at her with a look so cold it could have frozen the sun. "The time for misunderstandings was before you called 911 and described me as a violent squatter. The time for grace was before your son hurled racial slurs at me while trying to break into my property. We're well past misunderstanding. Brenda, we're in the realm of consequences now." With that, the officers got to work. Officer Miller continued questioning Brenda, her words tumbling out in half-coherent excuses while the blinking red light of his body cam captured every one of them, her frantic, unraveling attempt to rewrite what had just happened. Meanwhile, Officer Chun documented my account with quiet professionalism, recording every detail: the timeline, Kevin's actions, the threats, the video footage I had ready for upload. A second patrol car had arrived by then, and an officer from that unit was now quietly speaking with Kevin, who stood pale and motionless at the curb, his former cockiness drained away and replaced by the stunned realization that this wasn't going to be fixed with a phone call to Mommy. After about 20 minutes, the officers wrapped up their initial work. What began as a theatrical power play by Brenda and her son had officially become a criminal investigation, one with body cams, timestamps, sworn statements, and most importantly, undeniable evidence. Informed that charges would be filed and that they'd be contacted soon by the city prosecutor's office, Brenda and Kevin were released to go home, a far cry from the victory parade Brenda had likely imagined. Their slow, silent shuffle back down the street, shoulders slumped and eyes downcast, stood in humiliating contrast to the smug, righteous strut Brenda had made just an hour earlier. The immediate threat was neutralized, but I knew deep down this wasn't over. It was only the first battle in a much larger war. Brenda wasn't merely an obnoxious neighbor. She was the HOA president, wielding institutional authority like a personal weapon, and the false police report was merely a symptom of a deeper, more insidious rot. For my peace, and for the dignity of every homeowner who had suffered under her tyranny, I needed to take her down not with anger or drama, but with facts, law, and strategy. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon on what had to be the most chaotic first day in a new home anyone's ever had, I sat at my dining room table not to unpack or relax, but to wage a quiet war. I cracked open the thick welcome packet Brenda herself had smugly delivered earlier that day. A glass of bourbon sat beside me, untouched as I flipped through the pages with a highlighter in one hand and a legal pad in the other. I read every line of the covenants, every clause in the conditions, every footnote in the restrictions. I cross-referenced bylaws with the Articles of Incorporation, scrutinized the budget sheets, and circled every questionable line item. Years of detective work had taught me that people like Brenda, bullies in charge, tyrants hiding behind bylaws, always leave a trail. They think they're untouchable, and that makes them careless. And I was betting the full weight of my new mortgage that Brenda had been very, very careless. By the next morning, determined to put boots on the ground, I stepped outside for some neighborly recon. I spotted an older couple in the yard next door, tending their flowers with quiet grace. I walked over, offered a friendly wave, and introduced myself. "Hi, I'm Marcus, your new neighbor." The man, who introduced himself as David, offered a warm, firm handshake and a smile that felt genuinely kind. His wife, Susan, looked up from her garden bed and gave me a wave and a nod, her eyes twinkling with welcome. Hadn't seen in many retirees, sharp, calculating, and ready for battle. "You know, Marcus," he said, wiping his hands on a gardening towel. "I've been waiting a long time for someone with a little fire to move in next door." Susan gave a knowing chuckle, brushing dirt from her gloves. "She's made a lot of enemies, but people have been too afraid or too tired to stand up to her." I leaned in slightly, the wheels already turning. "I think that's about to change." Over the next hour, what began as a neighborly chat blossomed into a full strategic session. David shared everything he'd kept in mental notes over the years: questionable contracts awarded without bidding, repeated landscaping jobs billed to the HOA that always seemed to benefit Brenda's corner lot, and an especially eyebrow-raising expense listed as community beautification that involved installing high-end pavers exclusively in front of her own driveway. With each new revelation, my determination solidified. Brenda's power wasn't rooted in law or legitimacy, it was built on intimidation, opacity, and apathy. She ruled because no one had ever challenged her with a tool she didn't understand: accountability and evidence. And now, thanks to a brilliant retired accountant with a long memory and a file drawer of receipts, those tools were finally in my hands. As the sun climbed higher and the scent of fresh soil mixed with the faint hint of jasmine, I looked out over the pristine lawns of Willow Creek Estates and saw it differently for the first time, not as a hostile territory, but as a battleground worth fighting for. I thanked David and Susan warmly, promising to keep in touch soon. As I walked back to my house, I pulled out my phone, opened a new note titled Operation Reclaim Willow Creek, and typed the first item: audit Brenda's budget, every single line. He hadn't been involved in years at least. That's what I had suspected, but when he finally spoke, saying, "Son, you have no idea how long I've been waiting for someone to say that," it was clear something had shifted. In that moment, the alliance was forged and the counteroffensive was set into motion. My conversation with David felt like unlocking a door I didn't even know existed. He turned out to be a goldmine of institutional insight. A quiet but razor-sharp observer, David had silently documented years of Brenda's overreaches and abuses, patiently waiting for the right moment and the right ally to push back. Now he had both. The next morning, we met in my kitchen, sipping coffee while the notorious H.O.A. binder lay open between us like a war map. My structured, evidence-driven police background paired seamlessly with David's meticulous, numbers-savvy accountant brain. We became a two-man insurgency, laying the groundwork for an internal revolution. Our first strike, a formal, legally airtight request for records, meticulously citing the precise clauses in the HOA bylaws that guaranteed homeowners access to financial disclosures. We demanded a full 3-year line-item budget, complete bank statements, and every vendor contract or invoice exceeding $500. Written in measured, clinical language, we sent the request via certified mail to Brenda and copied the entire HOA. Board an unmistakable declaration that we were serious and by the book. Predictably, Brenda tried to stonewall us. A week later, her terse response arrived. She claimed our request was overly broad and unnecessary, asserting that the single-page budget summary from the welcome packet was adequate. She even included another copy of that worthless document. But in her arrogance, she slipped. She didn't deny the request outright, just delayed it, which, according to the bylaws, she couldn't do without an official board vote. That procedural misstep became our first real leverage against her shaky leadership. While David kept digging through the numbers, I turned my attention to another front entirely. My years on the job had given me a thorough understanding of how municipal bureaucracy truly worked, and more importantly, a robust network of contacts scattered across various city departments. I had no intention of using my badge to pull rank or demand special treatment, but I knew precisely which public records to ask for and the best way to go about it. So, I made a quiet trip downtown to the city's planning and zoning department, where I filed a request for every permit, plan, and inspection report tied to Brenda's property over the past decade. It was a long shot, but something in my gut told me that someone who brazenly ignored her own HOA's regulations probably didn't care much for city building codes either. While I waited for those documents, I shifted focus toward coalition building. David, Susan, and I began quietly reaching out to other neighbors, not by rallying or preaching, but simply by listening. We'd catch people casually while they checked their mail or strolled with their dogs, and say, "We're new here and had a strange encounter with the HOA president. Have you ever had issues?" That single question was like pulling the pin on a grenade. One story after another came pouring out, each more absurd than the last. A young couple fined $200 because their toddler's plastic slide was briefly visible from the street. A grieving widower denied permission to plant a memorial tree for his late wife simply because Brenda didn't like the type. An engineer who had a lien slapped on his home over a disagreement about window trim color. These people had spent years feeling isolated, bullied, and helpless. Now, for the first time, they realized they weren't alone. A genuine groundswell of frustration was forming, and it was starting to find a voice. Then, about 2 weeks into our efforts, I received a call from the city clerk my public records request was ready. I headed straight down to pick it up, and once I was back in my car, parked in the city hall lot, I began thumbing through the paperwork, and that's when I saw it, or rather didn't see it. There were records for the original house construction and a minor fence permit from years ago, but nothing else. 9 years ago, the last official permit was filed, a minor fence approval, but what was glaringly absent from the city records was staggering. The enormous 200-square-foot she shed in Brenda's backyard, fully equipped with electrical wiring and plumbing, simply didn't exist on paper. Nor did the sprawling, multi-level flagstone patio she'd installed, complete with a built-in fire pit and an outdoor kitchen. No permits, no inspections, no plans, nothing. She had made extensive, costly additions to her property completely under the radar, a blatant violation of city codes that came with steep penalties and the threat of forced demolition or mandatory compliance. For someone who fined neighbors over mailbox colors and plastic toys, the hypocrisy was almost laughable. This was a ticking legal time bomb and a powerful weapon in our growing arsenal. But the true smoking gun came from David, still frustrated by Brenda's refusal to release full financial records. He decided to work a little forensic accounting magic. On the one-page summary Brenda had provided, he spotted a suspiciously large budget item labeled simply Community Landscaping and Beautification, $28,000. That was an enormous figure for a neighborhood where homeowners mostly handled their own yards. Trusting his instincts, David searched public business registries for landscaping companies operating in our county, hoping to match a name Brenda had casually mentioned at HOA meetings. Nothing came up. Then, with a flash of insight, he pivoted searching. Not by vendor, but by Brenda's name and address. Still nothing. But Susan, ever observant, recalled Brenda's maiden name from years past. Armed with that one forgotten detail, David tried again. Bingo. A company called Evergreen Designs LLC was registered to Brenda's residential address, not a commercial location, and listed her as the sole officer and agent, using her maiden name. It was a shell company, plain and simple. Brenda had essentially been cutting checks from HOA funds straight into her own pocket. David was buzzing with adrenaline when he called me, barely able to contain himself. "I found it, Marcus," he said breathlessly. "I found everything." "I found it," David said, nearly shaking with adrenaline. "She's been paying herself for an entire decade." Brenda had been submitting bogus invoices under the name of her phantom company and quietly cutting checks from the HOA's bank account to fund her personal landscaping, her luxury patio, her seasonal flower beds, every penny traced back to community funds. This wasn't just a breach of bylaws anymore. This was full-blown embezzlement, wire fraud, and mail fraud, a felony-level crime hidden in plain sight. At that moment, our collection of scattered ammunition transformed into a full arsenal. We had the original altercation, the false police report, the trespassing, and the racist remarks all fully documented. We had city code violations, enough to bury any ordinary homeowner in fines. We had a chorus of testimonials from neighbors who had suffered her petty tyranny for years. And now we had the kill shot, irrefutable proof that Brenda had been siphoning money from the HOA for a decade to fund her lavish lifestyle, laundering it through a shell company under her maiden name. This changed everything. We weren't just planning to remove her from power, we were going to hold her accountable in every sense of the word. The annual HOA meeting was just 3 weeks away, typically a sleepy, empty formality where Brenda droned on for an hour before rubber stamping her own re-election and budget. But this time, we were going to rewrite the script. It would be a reckoning. Over the next 2 weeks, we worked tirelessly. We packaged every piece of evidence into a clean, persuasive presentation. David distilled the financial fraud into a simplified breakdown that even the least numbers-savvy neighbor could grasp. I curated the testimonial stories into a damning, cohesive narrative of abuse and intimidation. We printed handouts, cross-checked timelines, rehearsed every detail. Then we mobilized. We went door to door, calling, texting, emailing, urging every single person we had spoken to, every neighbor who had suffered in silence, to show up and be counted. If you want change, we told them, you have to be in that room. The stage was perfectly set. Brenda was walking straight into the ambush she had unknowingly helped prepare, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering over her meticulously styled head. The night of the annual HOA meeting crackled with tension, the air thick with anticipation like moments before a thunderclap. The gathering was held in the sterile, echoing community center clubhouse, Brenda's longtime throne room, where she'd reigned with unchecked authority for years. Normally, these meetings attracted maybe a dozen or so people, a few loyal board members and some worn-out residents airing complaints that went nowhere. But tonight, the room was electric. Thanks to our quiet but relentless campaign, nearly every household in the neighborhood was represented. Over 100 people crammed into a space built for half that number, standing shoulder to shoulder, lined along the walls, and crowding the hallway just to be part of what was about to unfold. Their presence alone spoke volumes. As Brenda and her hand-picked board members filed in and took their usual places at the front table, she momentarily paused at the sight of the crowd, a brief flicker of surprise flashing across her face before being quickly masked by a smug, self-congratulatory smile. In her mind, this massive turnout validated her imagined popularity and the success of her iron-fisted leadership. Beside her sat her perpetually uncomfortable husband, Gary, looking like he wished he were anywhere else, and her parade of yes-men and one woman whose expression suggested independent thought had long since been discouraged. Brenda opened the meeting with her usual faux charming bravado, rapping a small gavel on the table and chirping, "Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see such a fantastic turnout tonight." She beamed as if the crowd were there to celebrate her completely. Misreading the mood. It shows just how deeply everyone cares about preserving the exceptional standards of Willow Creek Estates. Then she launched into a 20-minute monologue, rattling off her so-called accomplishments from the past year like a politician giving a victory speech, still unaware that the walls were closing in. Brenda continued her self-congratulatory ramble, proudly highlighting a fresh coat of paint on the clubhouse sign, the successful 4th of July picnic she personally organized, and her latest crusade removing unauthorized basketball hoops from driveways. The audience remained eerily silent, their restraint simmering just beneath the surface. Then came the moment we had been waiting for. She transitioned to the budget. With an air of smug confidence, she clicked the projector, displaying the same infuriatingly vague single-page summary she always used, as if the crowd hadn't doubled in size and scrutiny. "As you can see," she said, lazily sweeping a red laser pointer over the line item labeled Community Landscaping and Beautification. $28,000. We continue to invest heavily in keeping our common areas beautiful. Now I'll entertain a motion to approve the budget as presented." This was it. Before one of her ever-loyal sycophants could chime in with their rubber stamp approval, I rose slowly from my seat in the center of the room. "Madam President," I said clearly, my voice cutting through the heavy silence, "before we vote, I have a few questions about the budget. Under Article 4, Section 2 of the bylaws, I'd like to address the community." Dozens of heads turned to look at me. Brenda's face stiffened, her practiced smile freezing in place as her eyes narrowed into thin slits. "This isn't the forum for individual grievances, Mr. Thorne," she said with barely concealed contempt, mispronouncing my name yet again, a petty insult she'd clung to for months. "We have a full agenda." A low rumble moved through the crowd, a rising wave of tension ready to crest. Then from the back, a voice rang out, "Let him speak." Another followed, louder this time, "We have questions too." Brenda's facade cracked. Her face flushed red with anger as she realized the room was no longer hers. Her board glanced at each other nervously, the illusion of control slipping fast. She tightened her grip on the gavel, visibly debating whether to try and silence the room by force, but the unity in the crowd was undeniable. With a bitter glare and a voice full of reluctant venom, she finally spat, "Fine, be brief." "I will be," I said, already opening the folder in my hands. I walked to the front of the room, laptop in hand, every step deliberate, the tension so thick it felt like walking through water. David stood and joined me, calm and focused, the two of us moving in sync. "Folks," I began, addressing the crowd now fully riveted, "my name is Marcus Thorne. I've only lived here a month, but the things I've experienced led me to do some digging, and what I found is something every single one of you deserves to see." I connected my laptop to the projector, and in an instant, Brenda's fuzzy budget slide was replaced with a crystal-clear satellite image of my property, official boundaries outlined in bold red. "Let's start with the incident that triggered this investigation," I said, clicking to the next slide. "Just weeks ago, Brenda called the police and falsely accused me of being a violent squatter, all because I refused to let her son use my private pool." A gasp rippled through the crowd, echoing off the walls. I let the silence stretch just long enough to settle. "She claimed the pool was a shared amenity," I continued, "but as this county plot map clearly shows, it's entirely on my private property and always has been." I advanced to the next slide, the police case number and documentation of the false report and trespassing charge against her son. "This isn't opinion, it's public record," I stated calmly. Brenda shot up from her chair, face flushed, voice shrill. "This is a personal attack, this is slander. It has nothing to do with the HOA. "On the contrary, Brenda," I replied, turning to meet her glare, "this has everything to do with the HOA. This is about abuse of power, about a president who thinks she's above the law, who invents rules to serve her own interests." I nodded to David. He stepped forward, composed as ever. "Good evening, everyone," he said in a measured, authoritative tone. "My name is David, and I'm a retired forensic accountant. For years I've been concerned. Now I know why. David said, his voice calm but loaded with quiet intensity. He advanced the slide, revealing a meticulously detailed spreadsheet. Brenda refused our formal request for a full financial breakdown, which in itself violates HOA bylaws. So I turned to public records, and what I found was eye-opening. This $28,000 line item labeled beautification? The vast majority of that money over the last 10 years has been funneled to a single vendor, a company called Evergreen Designs, LLC. He paused, letting the name echo through the room like a drop pin in a cathedral. Brenda's face had lost all color, drained to a pale, waxy white as the truth began to dawn on the crowd. David clicked to the next slide, a screenshot of the state's corporate registry. There, in bold black and white, was the filing for Evergreen Designs, LLC, same home address as Brenda, same street, same block, but the name on the document, her maiden name. So, who owns Evergreen Designs? David asked, though the answer was already obvious. It's our H.O.A. president registered at her home under her maiden name. The room erupted. The gasps turned to shouts, voices raised in furious disbelief. Thief! Someone yelled. Embezzler! Another roared. Dozens of residents surged to their feet, pointing, accusing, their faces a mix of outrage and betrayal. For the first time, they saw clearly where their dues had gone, not into community improvements, but into Brenda's unpermitted patio, her carefully curated flower beds, her own private landscaper. Brenda stood frozen at the front of the room, caught in a hurricane of righteous fury. Her husband, Gary, looked down at his shoes like he wished the floor would open and swallow him whole. I stepped forward one final time. And speaking of that patio, I said, steady and controlled, clicking to the final slide. A large red nitrogen monoxide permits on file stamp was emblazoned across an aerial image of Brenda's backyard, her illegal additions, exposed in perfect clarity. It also appears, I continued, that our president, who has fined residents for the color of their shutters and toys left out for a few hours, built half her backyard without filing a single permit. Welcome Matt has constructed an entire wing onto her home completely illegally, without a single city permit or inspection. It seems the rules, whether financial, legal, or ethical, were only meant for the rest of us. That final revelation shattered whatever fragile hold Brenda had left. The dam broke. One of her longtime board members, who had sat quietly by her side for years, suddenly stood up and slammed his fist on the table. I will not be a party to this, he declared, his voice booming. I call for an immediate vote of no confidence in President Brenda. The motion was seconded by half the room in seconds, shouted over the rising swell of outrage. Chaos erupted. Brenda, red-faced and shrieking, hurled accusations and legal threats, calling us liars and promising lawsuits, but no one was listening anymore. Her voice was drowned out by the collective roar of fed-up neighbors finally finding theirs. The vote was called. It was unanimous. Brenda was removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. Her entire board, exposed and disgraced, resigned on the spot, unable to withstand the fury or the facts. In a daze, Brenda allowed Gary to guide her out of the room, still spewing venom and denial as they disappeared into the night. For a brief moment, the room went still, stunned silence thick with the weight of everything that had just happened. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Within seconds, the entire room joined in, applause crashing like waves, a collective exhale of relief and long-suppressed frustration. In the days that followed, a new interim board was appointed, and to no one's surprise, David was chosen reluctantly but resolutely as the new treasurer. They offered me the presidency, but I declined with a smile. I told you, I said. "I just want to swim in my pool." What followed was a whirlwind. A full professional forensic audit uncovered that Brenda had embezzled over $150,000 from the HOA over the past decade. The findings were immediately turned over to the district attorney. Before the indictment was filed, Brenda and Gary sold their home at a loss and left town. Kevin, her son, eventually pleaded guilty to misdemeanor charges. Kevin ultimately pled guilty to misdemeanor trespassing and was handed a sentence of community service along with a hefty fine. Meanwhile, the city came down hard on Brenda, hitting her with substantial penalties for the extensive unpermitted construction she had so smugly built without oversight. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, a new culture began to take root in Willow Creek Estates. The interim board operated with complete transparency, holding open meetings and publishing full financial reports for all to see. The absurd fines and arbitrary rules that had plagued the neighborhood for years were abolished, swept away like dust in a long overdue spring cleaning. Something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors started talking to each other again, not in whispers of fear or frustration, but in genuine conversation, like friends who had simply forgotten how to connect. As for my pool, the unlikely spark that had ignited this entire suburban revolution, it finally became the peaceful oasis I had envisioned. On warm evenings, David and Susan would sometimes drop by, and we'd sit beside the water with iced tea in hand, sharing laughs and marveling at the bizarre series of events that had unfolded. I had moved to the suburbs in search of peace and quiet, and in the strangest twist imaginable, I had to fight a war to find it. But by standing up to one tyrant, we had managed to free an entire community from fear and control. And as I floated on the still, sun-dappled surface of my pool, I realized that this calm, hard-won tranquility was its own kind of peace, deeper, stronger, and worth every battle. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. And hey, remember to be good to each other out there.